Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiast. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're heading into a really fascinating realm of thought, Latin American philosophy. I know you're all about those nuanced ideas and interconnected concepts, and this is a field that truly embodies that. It's like we're joining this centuries-long conversation, wrestling with those big philosophical questions, about knowledge, being, justice, the whole shebang. But what's really cool is that these questions are explored through lenses shaped by really unique circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. This isn't just some side note in the grand narrative of Western philosophy. It's a substantial, evolving body of work with its own twists and turns. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy lays it out, Latin American philosophy, well, includes everything produced philosophically within Latin America itself, but also by those of Latin American descent, no matter where they are in the world. And the timeline, it generally starts around 1550. Now, while its roots are firmly planted in the Western tradition, it constantly grapples with its own unique context, its own flavor, you could say. And just a heads up, there's a bit of a debate about including pre-Columbian thought in the mix. And sometimes the field expands to cover former French Caribbean colonies. Oh, and you'll run into various names for this area of thought. Spanish American, Hispanic American, Ibero-American, even Latino philosophy, each with their own subtle shades of meaning.
So for all of us, committed to philosophy, why should we really dive into this? Well, it brilliantly shows us how these fundamental philosophical inquiries, the ones we always grapple with, they're interpreted and reimagined through these distinct historical and social lenses. It forces us to step back and really examine those assumptions we often have about the universality of some of our philosophical frameworks.
Absolutely. Our goal in this deep dive is to unearth those core insights and trace the path of philosophical development in Latin America. We're going to pinpoint its unique contributions and explore those ongoing debates that, honestly, can enrich your own philosophical toolkit. We're working from a really comprehensive overview. Let's start by laying the historical groundwork, shall we?
Sounds good. Let's begin with the earliest layer, the pre-Columbian thought. Now, as a philosopher, you're used to arguments and clearly defined concepts. So how do we approach the reflective traditions of pre-Columbian America? Why is there even a debate about whether to call it philosophy at all?
It's a really good question. The thing is, major pre-Columbian civilizations definitely developed these intricate cosmologies, ethical frameworks, and ways of understanding reality. We see it in their myths, their social structures, the whole package. But here's the thing. They didn't typically express these ideas through that kind of abstract, systematic inquiry that became the hallmark of Western philosophy, especially after antiquity. Plus, our access to those ideas is often indirect, filtered through the colonizer's point of view, which adds another layer of complexity.
So a different way of engaging intellectually with the world.
For the most part, yes. It was sophisticated, no doubt, but these reflections were deeply intertwined with religious beliefs and practices, not necessarily framed as those secular, purely rational investigations that we often associate with the word philosophy. The dominant view, as our source points out, is that pre-Columbian thought didn't have a huge direct impact on the philosophical developments that followed after the Spanish conquest. It's a fascinating area of study, no doubt, and it definitely makes us rethink the very definition of philosophy. But if we're focusing on Latin American philosophy as part of the Western tradition, the colonial period, that's where things really kick off.
Right. And with the Spanish arriving in the mid-16th century, European philosophy came along for the ride, and scholasticism was the big player. Now, I know you're familiar with its medieval roots. How did it take shape in the Latin American colonies?
So scholasticism, the philosophical heavyweight of the Middle Ages, was all about blending Christian theology and Aristotelian logic. That emphasis on systematic argumentation and hierarchical structures, it really shaped early intellectual life in the colonies. The Spanish and Portuguese clergy, they established the first learning centers, brought those ideas across the ocean. Thinkers like Suarez, Vittoria, Aquinas, Duns Scotus, they were the core curriculum. Many European intellectuals even settled in the Americas, further embedding these traditions.
Were there any significant philosophical voices coming from within the colonies during this scholastic period?
Definitely. The source highlights some important thinkers who were actually born in the Americas. There's Alonso de la Vera Cruz. He wrote some of the earliest philosophical works there. Then you have Tomás de Mercado and Antonio Rubio. Rubio's work, Logica Mexicana, it even gained recognition in Europe, which shows how the Americas were already contributing to philosophical discourse in a way that resonated back in Europe. And we also can't forget the growing influence of humanism, especially the remarkable figure of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 17th century. She was the first Latin American thinker to really articulate concerns about the status of women. She's considered, retrospectively, the first Latin American feminist philosopher. She was pretty bold, defending women's right to education and intellectual pursuits.
That's awesome. Now, moving into the 18th and early 19th centuries, the philosophical landscape shifted with the Enlightenment. You'll appreciate this. Being a philosopher, the Enlightenment had a huge impact on political thought. How did these Enlightenment ideas fuel those independence movements in Latin America?
The focus really shifted to political thought, heavily influenced by modern philosophy and those big Enlightenment ideas. While someone like Descartes did have some influence on intellectual discourse, it was those liberal political ideals championed by French Enlightenment thinkers. Those were the ideas that really fueled the independence movements. Leaders like Bolivar, Hidalgo, Morelos, and later Martí, they were all deeply shaped by concepts of liberty, individual rights, and popular sovereignty. Of course, we can't forget scholasticism completely. It still held sway in some circles.
Right, and once independence was achieved, the focus turned to building new nations. That's when positivism, with its emphasis on scientific progress, gained traction. As a philosopher, you understand how ideas and societal development are intertwined. So what made positivism so appealing in this context?
Well, think about it. These newly independent nations, they were facing huge practical challenges. They needed to establish stable institutions, foster social and economic development. Positivism, with its promise of applying scientific methods to social organization to progress itself, it seemed like the perfect framework. That positivist motto, order and progress, the one famously inscribed on the Brazilian flag, captures this ambition perfectly. It became a dominant ideology. It was even adopted as the official state philosophy in some nations. Of course, it was also controversially used at times to justify authoritarian regimes in the name of progress.
It's interesting how ideas can be used in such different ways. So who are the key figures spreading this positivist thought in Latin America?
The entry mentions Gabino Barreda and Justo Sierra in Mexico, José Victorino Lastarria in Chile, and Domingo Faustino Sarmiento in Argentina. These thinkers saw positivism as the way to modernize their nations. They believed in this rational scientific basis for social change. And we can't forget those transitional figures like Andrés Bello, Juan Bautista Alberdi, and Esteban Echevarria. They bridged the gap between the liberalism of the independence movements and this rising tide of positivism. Interestingly, even within this positivist movement, some early critical voices started to emerge. Thinkers like José Ingenieros and Carlos Vaz Ferreira, who would later play a role in its decline.
That brings us to the 20th century and what the entry calls the contemporary period, starting with a rebellion against positivism. You know how intellectual history is often marked by these turning points? What were the philosophical drivers behind this rebellion?
This was a crucial moment, for sure, starting around 1910. You had this new generation of philosophers, many of whom were actually trained in positivist frameworks, and they started pushing back. Figures like Alejandro Korn in Argentina, José Vasconcelos and Antonio Caso in Mexico, and Carlos Vaz Ferreira in Uruguay, they're often called the generation of founders. They felt that positivism, with its strict materialism and determinism, it just couldn't fully account for human experience. They were interested in those subjective, volitional aspects that positivism seemed to ignore. This rebellion marked a huge shift away from this purely scientific, materialist worldview to one that embraced human experience, consciousness, values, all that.
So where did they turn to articulate this critique? What philosophical resources did they draw upon?
They looked to European intellectual currents that offered alternatives to positivist thought. French vitalism and intuitionism were big influences. Henri Bergson, for instance, he emphasized lived experience and intuition. And later, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, his visit proved really crucial. He introduced those ideas from German philosophers of the spirit, like Max Scheler and Nikolai Hartmann. This had a huge impact on what we call the generation of forgers, thinkers like Samuel Ramos, Francisco Romero, and José Carlos Mariátegui, who often used this more literary and expressive style in their philosophical work. This fundamentally shifted the purpose of philosophical inquiry in the region. It wasn't just about serving predetermined religious, political, or nationalistic ends anymore. It became about exploring philosophical concerns for their own sake.
It sounds like this period marks a significant step toward philosophy becoming a more professional, specialized field in Latin America with a real focus on abstract philosophical questions.
Exactly. For the first time, you see thinkers pursuing philosophy as its own discipline. driven by these internal philosophical disagreements with positivism. They were bothered by its perceived denial of human freedom and agency. They grappled with questions of being, consciousness, value. But, as the entry points out, while they were critical of positivism, they didn't always apply that same critical lens to the European solutions they adopted. They came later.
That leads us to the next phase, normalcy in the generation of 1910, starting around the 1940s. What sets this period apart in terms of philosophical development?
This era is all about growing self-awareness, a conscious effort to articulate a distinctly Latin American philosophical perspective. The entry calls this Latin Americanism. The generation born around 1910, they were often the first to benefit from more formal philosophical education within universities. Thinkers like Rizieri Frondizi, Leopoldo Zea, and Francisco Miro Quesada, they emerged as leading figures. This wasn't just about nationalism, though. It involved serious philosophical debates about whether a unique Latin American way of thinking actually existed, whether it should be cultivated, often in response to this perceived European intellectual dominance.
So it's like this philosophical quest for identity starts taking center stage.
Precisely. That question of whether there was an autochthonous, like a truly original Latin American philosophy, became a central point of contention. Thinkers like Samuel Ramos and Leopoldo Zea, they tackled this head-on. And this led to more study, more dissemination of Latin American philosophical thought within the region. Now, the exchange of philosophical ideas between Latin American countries, it did increase, but it still had its challenges. It's also worth noting that this was a time of political instability. And the exile of intellectuals, while obviously a tragedy, ironically fostered more inter-American philosophical dialogue because those exiled thinkers carried their ideas across borders. The arrival of Spanish émigrés after the Spanish Civil War also played a key role. They helped strengthen university philosophy programs and broke down those national intellectual barriers. In terms of the dominant philosophical trends during this time, we're talking about phenomenology, existentialism, especially Heidegger and Sartre, a resurgence of Thomism, and a growing interest in both philosophical analysis and Marxism.
It's like the stage was being set. The entry calls the next period maturity, from the 1960s to the present. What are the hallmarks of this mature phase of Latin American philosophy?
The key thing here is the increase in originality, depth, and international recognition of the philosophical work coming out of Latin America. Those trends we saw during the normalcy period, the critical engagement with European thought, increased dialogue within Latin America, stronger institutional foundations, they solidified, and this led to a general rise in the quality and sophistication of philosophical inquiry. Now, there wasn't some huge explosion of new journals and conferences, but existing ones were really active, which tells you there was this sustained, serious engagement with philosophical issues.
Right, and the entry highlights 4 major philosophical currents within this mature period. Let's dive into those, starting with socialist and Marxist thought. Now, you're familiar with the history of Marxism. What makes its development in Latin America stand out?
Latin America has a long history with socialist ideas, even going back to the 19th century. Figures like Saint-Simon and Fourier influenced folks like Esteban Echeverria. In the 20th century, José Carlos Mariátegui developed a really unique heterodox form of Marxism. He even suggested there might be some points of convergence between religious thought and Marxist analysis, and he questioned whether those rigid European historical stages could be applied to Latin America.
The entry says that Latin American Marxism has some core commitments. What are some of the defining principles that characterize it?
Central to it all is a strong commitment to anti-imperialism and anti-neocolonialism. They see these forces as intertwined with class oppression. They advocate for socialist democratic change, or, in some cases, revolution. There's also a big emphasis on socialist humanism, the goal being to overcome alienation and exploitation inherent in capitalism and to promote genuine economic and social equality. Philosophy is seen as a tool for understanding the world, analyzing capitalism, and figuring out what socialism could look like. It's about guiding action, ultimately, and the development of class consciousness. That's crucial for social transformation. The ideas of Antonio Gramsci, especially his concept of cultural hegemony and the role of organic intellectuals, have been really influential. Importantly, after 1960, Marxism gained a lot of legitimacy within academia. Harold Davis argued that it became a very common ideological conviction among intellectuals. Some prominent academic Marxists of this period are Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez and Cayo Prado Jr.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Let's move on to the second major current, philosophical analysis. Now, you're familiar with its origins in the Anglo-American tradition. What's its trajectory been like in Latin America? What makes it distinctive?
Philosophical analysis arrived a bit later in Latin America, and it didn't have as big of an impact initially. This is partly because it was so technical and partly because of a perceived connection to 19th century positivism. But it grew quickly. We see this in the establishment of influential journals like Critica in Mexico, Análisis Filosófico in Argentina, and Manuscrito in Brazil. Plus, professional societies like SADAF in Argentina were formed. This led to international recognition for Latin American analytic philosophy in a few key areas. There's Eduardo Rebosi, his work on human rights theory is highly respected, and Carlos Nino's consensual theory of punishment and legal philosophy is also very influential. In logic, the contributions of Newton da Costa to paraconsistent logic and Carlos Alcron to the AGM model of belief change are internationally known.
It's amazing to see Latin American philosophers contributing to these specialized areas within analytic philosophy. But the entry also mentions a criticism. It says that analytic philosophy in Latin America sometimes doesn't engage with the specific social and political issues of the region. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a valid point, and it's debated a lot. It's true that the technical nature of some areas within analytic philosophy can make it seem detached from immediate social concerns. However, the entry also points out that lots of Latin American analytic philosophers have been very active in addressing social and political issues. Think about Rebosi and Nino. They were both involved in Argentine public life, and even within abstract areas like logic, thinkers like da Costa and Elcheron explored how their theories could be applied to practical things, like law. Plus, many analytic philosophers in the region have focused directly on ethical and political questions. Some were even involved in the Zapatista rebellion in Mexico, which shows a real commitment to connecting their work with real-world issues.
That's a good point. Now, the third major current is the philosophy of liberation. This sounds distinctly Latin American. As a philosopher interested in how unique intellectual traditions develop, what stands out to you about its origins and key features?
The philosophy of liberation is definitely a homegrown philosophical perspective. It emerged in the early 1970s, primarily through Argentinian philosophers like Arturo Andrés Roig, Horacio Soria-Goldberg, and Enrique Dussel. Dussel became a central figure, helping to spread its ideas internationally. It draws inspiration from liberation theology, dependency theory, and a combination of Catholic and Marxist ideas. Some of its key tenets are intellectual independence from those dominant Western philosophical traditions, economic autonomy for Latin American nations, advocating for political regimes that prioritize the poor and indigenous populations, and centering the experiences of the Third World in philosophical inquiry.
And it sounds like its rise and spread are closely tied to political events.
You're right. The period of intense political repression in Argentina, the late 1970s and early 1980s, led to the exile of many key figures in the movement. While this scattering created some tension within the movement, it also helped to spread their ideas to other parts of Latin America and even beyond. The whole idea of intellectual autonomy wasn't brand new. Thinkers like Ramos, Zea, and Salazar-Bondi had raised similar concerns about dependence on European thought. But the philosophy of liberation developed this into a full-blown critique of European and North American dominance across the board, intellectual, economic, social. They argued that these dominant frameworks often marginalize or even suppress the experiences and concerns of people outside their centers of power.
It sounds like a powerful and influential perspective, but the entry mentions it has its critics. What are some of the key challenges or debates within the philosophy of liberation?
Definitely. There have been internal disagreements and critiques. Some argue that it hasn't adequately addressed gender and sexuality, or the complexities of different identities beyond class and nation. Others have suggested that even though it critiques Eurocentrism, some aspects of its framework might still reflect European biases. It's interesting that while it's often been overlooked or dismissed by mainstream analytics philosophy, the philosophy of liberation has probably had the biggest impact of any Latin American philosophical development outside of the region. Enrique Dussel has had extensive dialogues with prominent philosophers in Europe and North America.
It's amazing how ideas can travel. Now, the fourth and final current highlighted is the history of philosophy. This seems more like a methodological approach than a distinct philosophical current. Why is its development since the 1960s considered so significant?
You see, before the 1960s, the study of the history of philosophy in Latin America often lacked rigor and depth. But since then, there's been a huge transformation in the quality and quantity of historical research. It covers a wide range of periods within Western philosophy, and even extends to non-Western traditions. There's a much bigger emphasis on engaging with primary sources in their original languages, using critical methodologies, and contributing to international scholarship. The fact that we see specialized journals dedicated to specific historical periods, like medieval philosophy, shows a real commitment to serious historical inquiry. It's about pursuing historical understanding for its own sake and contributing to the global community of philosophical historians.
So it sounds like all of this points towards a real coming of age for philosophy in Latin America in the latter half of the 20th century. It seems like it reached a level of sophistication and diversity comparable to those philosophical centers in Europe and North America.
That's the general consensus. Thematic breadth, methodological sophistication, and growing international engagement, these are all hallmarks of the contemporary Latin American philosophical landscape. And the entry rightly acknowledges those significant contributions made by philosophers of Hispanic or Latin American descent working in the U.S. and Canada. Thinkers like George Santayana, Hector Neri Castañeda, Mario Bunge, Ernest Sosa, Jorge J. E. Gracia, Linda Martin Alcoff. They've all made important contributions across various areas of philosophy. Plus, within the U.S., there's this emerging sense of a distinct Latino identity in philosophy, focusing on things like race, ethnicity, nationality, and feminism. And this often draws directly on the history of Latin American philosophical thought.
That's fascinating. Now, the final section of the entry focuses on some problems and topics of particular concern within Latin American philosophy. The first one mentioned is the rights of Amerindians, which, as the entry notes, has a long history. What makes this issue so significant in the Latin American context?
The debate over Amerindian rights is, in fact, the oldest distinct philosophical problem in Latin America. It goes all the way back to the 16th century, and those huge moral and political questions raised by the Spanish conquest. The famous Valladolid debate between Juan Genestes Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas, remember that one? They argued about the nature of indigenous populations and whether Spanish rule was justified. It's a foundational moment in the development of ideas about natural rights and the ethics of colonialism. The whole question of whether Amerindians were inherently inferior, whether they were natural slaves, had terrible consequences for how they were treated. Now, views on indigenous populations have shifted over the centuries, often reflecting the social and political agendas of the time. But in the 20th century, there was a renewed philosophical interest in their rights and status. You see it in the work of Mariátegui, Vasconcelos, and Duffel. The lead-up to the 500th anniversary of the conquest in 1992 sparked a lot of discussion about indigenous identity, self-determination, and political representation. Philosophers like Luis Villoro, Fernando Salmerón, and Leon Olivet made important contributions. This is still a crucial area of philosophical inquiry, addressing issues of race, ethnicity, and political justice in Latin America today.
The second enduring challenge is the identity of the people. With such a complex history of migrations and cultural interactions, defining a unified Latin American identity seems like a really tough philosophical problem.
It really is. From the first encounters between European colonizers and indigenous populations, made even more complex by the forced migration of Africans, this question of what makes a shared identity, a unified people, has been central. Even during those independence movements, leaders like Simon Bolivar and José Martí, they tried to forge unity based on shared political ideals rather than racial or ethnic homogeneity. But after independence, those positivist ideologies often favored European immigration and sometimes promoted discriminatory views toward indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. This triggered different reactions, like the indigenismo movement after the Mexican Revolution. There were various attempts to define a unifying identity, whether it was based on shared racial heritage, like José Vasconcelos' concept of the cosmic race, or shared cultural heritage, like what Leopoldo Zea proposed. This ongoing philosophical quest to understand and define Latin American identity, and even the related question of U.S. Latino identity, is still a major area of philosophical engagement. Thinkers like Linda Martin Alcoff, Jorge Corlet, and Jorge J. E. Gracia are all active in these discussions.
It's fascinating how identity continues to be such a central question. Another prominent area mentioned is philosophical anthropology. The entry says this arose partly as a reaction against the scientific reductionism of positivism. What were some of the alternative perspectives offered on the nature of being human?
Right, as opposed to that positivist view of understanding humans purely through empirical science, different philosophical anthropologies popped up. They each emphasized different aspects of human existence. One big one was vitalistic anthropology, influenced by Bergson's philosophy of life. It stressed freedom, consciousness, lived experience. Thinkers like Carlos Vaz Ferreira, Adolfo de Ustua, and Antonio Caso are key figures here. Another current was the anthropology of the spirit, drawing on those phenomenological and hermeneutic traditions of thinkers like Husserl, Dilthey, Scheller, and Hartmann. This focused on the unique characteristics of human consciousness and experience. You see this in Samuel Ramos's work on feeling and Francisco Romero's work on the dual nature of human beings. Then there were various existentialist and Marxist perspectives. Thinkers like Carlos Estrada and Vicente Ferreira da Silva, influenced by Heidegger, questioning the whole notion of a fixed human essence. And the Hyperion group in Mexico, they were short-lived but influential, exploring existentialist themes related to Mexican identity.
So many different ways of approaching this fundamental question. The fourth topic mentioned is Latin America's philosophical identity. It's like this meta-philosophical debate that's been at the heart of the field. What are the main perspectives in this debate?
The question of Latin America's philosophical identity has been a constant and sometimes heated debate throughout the 20th century. It's all about those fundamental issues. Does Latin American philosophy even exist as a distinct entity? What defines it? Is it original? Is it authentic? The entry outlines four main approaches to these questions. First, there's the universalist perspective, like Ruggieri-Frondizi. They assess Latin American philosophy based on how well it adheres to universal science-like standards, and they often find it lacking originality. Second, there's the culturalist perspective, with Leopoldo Zia as a key figure. They argue that truth and philosophical inquiry are always shaped by context, so Latin American philosophy is valid as an expression of its unique circumstances, regardless of whether it's strictly original in terms of themes or methods. Third, you have the critical perspective, notably from Augusto Salazar Bondi. They see Latin American philosophy as inauthentic because they think it mostly imitates trends from developed nations without really addressing its own specific realities. And finally, there's the ethnic perspective, developed by Jorge J. E. Gracia. He defines Latin American philosophy simply as the philosophical work produced by Latin American people. This allows for internal diversity while acknowledging the potential for both universality and authenticity within that framework. This debate, which really got going with Zia and Frondizi, remains a central point of discussion and self-reflection within Latin American philosophy.
It's amazing how meta-philosophy can really shape a field. Finally, the entry talks about feminist philosophy in Latin America. It highlights this sometimes uneasy relationship it has with mainstream academic philosophy in the region. What are some of the defining characteristics and developments of feminist philosophy in this context?
The relationship between feminist philosophy and mainstream academia in Latin America has definitely been complicated. Some argue that feminist philosophical insights are more at home in broader feminist theory and activist movements than within the formal academic discipline. But even so, there's been a constant stream of academic feminist work since the late 19th century. There were important early figures like Carlos Vaz Ferreira and Graciela Hiro, and the field really expanded in the 1980s with scholars like Maria Luza Femenias, Ophelia Schutt, and Yolanda Angulo. Latin American feminist philosophy often draws from international feminist scholarship and local Latin American feminist activism and social science research. Compared to feminist philosophy in the U.S., there's often more emphasis on family structures, class differences, and ethnic identities. Plus, there's a strong element of self-critique within Latin American feminist philosophy, examining those challenges and potential biases involved in doing feminist work in the Latin American context, considering things like epistemic and cultural privilege. The continued importance of activist philosophy and interdisciplinary approaches, that seems likely to shape its future.
Wow, this has been a truly in-depth exploration of Latin American philosophy. It's a dynamic field, that's for sure, with a long and complex history. It grapples with those big philosophical questions from its own unique perspectives, making significant contributions to philosophical discussions worldwide.
Absolutely. We've traced its evolution from the early influence of European scholasticism to the emergence of those distinct Latin American philosophical currents, each engaging critically with both its own context and those global philosophical traditions. Those ongoing debates about identity, authenticity, and the role of philosophy in addressing social and political realities, they highlight its continued relevance for any philosopher who wants a broader understanding of the discipline.
So, for all of you out there deeply engaged with philosophy, we'll leave you with this thought. How does this exploration of Latin American philosophy, with its unique history and distinctive approach to those core philosophical questions, challenge your assumptions about the universality or context independence of philosophical inquiry? How might the very idea of a geographically or culturally situated philosophy shape your understanding of philosophical truth itself? There's a lot to think about.
We encourage you to dig deeper into that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry or explore the works of those fascinating thinkers and movements we've discussed today. There's a wealth of philosophical insight waiting to be discovered in this vibrant and important tradition.